Welcome back to our Learning Unit 8, which deals with project risk. And this is Chapter 8 as well. This Learning Unit only has one theme, and we'll be talking about project risk. So at the end of this, you should be able to, you should know what it is to manage risk in a project, identify and categorize what those risks are, assess and prioritize risks, prepare a risk response plan, and also a risk assessment matrix, control project risk, and discuss the critical factors relating to managing risks in a project. So what are project risks? Project risks are those things that can jeopardize the achieving of the project objective, delivering the content, delivering the advertising plan, delivering the bridge, delivering the piece of software. It could be anything that can jeopardize it, whether it is a resource issue or whether it is a budget constraint issue. You should, at the beginning of your project, when you put together your risk plan, you should sit down with as many people as possible and all the stakeholders and brainstorm some of the sources of those risks. What will also help is to look at historical information. So when you've done a similar project before, how do you go about drawing on that experience in order to ensure that you can see all the risks? Because project risks aren't those ones that you know about. Project risks are those ones that you might not have foreseen, because every risk that you know of, you put a risk mitigation plan in place. You try to mitigate that risk, you try to plan for that risk, and in that way, it doesn't become a risk anymore. In that way, it stops being a risk once you put a mitigation plan in place. Establish the different risks and evaluate them, put a score to them, put the likelihood in terms of what the likelihood is that that particular risk will happen, or that particular intervention will happen, or that particular occurrence will be. You need to assess the risk, determine the likelihood of that risk event will occur. And again, this is part of the combined experience. It is part of the combined experience of the project team, all of the stakeholders. It is the experience, your own experience. It is part of the historical record as well. And also, you should, if you're working in a specific industry or doing specific projects over and over, you should have a very clear understanding of what the likelihood of certain risks or certain risk events will be. Evaluate the degree of impact, and this is important. You should be able to evaluate how much that risk event will impact your organization and the particular project objective, and then prioritize it. The likelihood of the occurrence versus the degree of impact, and position relative to the critical path. This is an example of a risk assessment matrix. You have your risk running on the side, which is the risk event, the impact that it might have, and then the likelihood, which is low, medium, and high, and then degree of impact, which is low, medium, and high, and then action on trigger. What do you do if that risk event takes place? So this is the mitigation. What do you do? What's the event? What's the action that you take when that risk event takes place? Or some sort of trigger event that you put in place. So in this case, there's rain on the day of the event, and the trigger event is that the weather forecast 2 days before the event, and Laura is responsible for then kicking into gear a response plan, which is reserve indoor space now, recruit extra volunteers, develop a detailed action plan. And this is in mitigation of potentially the rain washing out the event. And then road construction, reduced attendance, reduced revenue, likelihood is high, degree of impact high. And what happens that in this case, the trigger event is the department tells them, listen, we are potentially not going to go ahead with that construction. Alison then has to put a plan in place to manage that particular event, or at least a response plan as well. The response plan is a set of actions to prevent or reduce the likelihood of occurrence or the impact of a risk implementing of the risk event occurs. Those set of actions is quite important, because if that mitigation is to ensure that the project can still deliver its project objective. You have to establish some sort of trigger point. You have to establish some sort of thing that triggers off a set or response to that event or the likelihood of that event, and assign responsibility for implementation of the alternate plan. Avoid, mitigate, or accept the risk. So you try to avoid it first of all, which is the first line of action. You mitigate, which is the second line of action, and then you accept the risk. If it is a very high likelihood and it has a high impact, a high likelihood that it will occur, and a high impact on the organization, then it is a critical risk that will affect the entire delivery of the project. Include contingency fund to cover the implementation cost. And that is when we were doing the budget, there was a section in which I talked about the reserve. You must have some sort of reserve or some sort of contingency in place to cover the cost of mitigation plans. So some of the critical success factors when managing risk in a project is identify risks and their potential impacts right when the project starts. Involve the project team or experts in assessing those risks. And again, it is likelihood that it will occur, likelihood as well as impact on the project. Assign a high priority to risks that have a high likelihood of occurrence and a high potential impact on the project. So those double H risk events are quite important. They should be right at the top of your list. Develop response plans for addressing high priority risk. There needs to be a detailed response plan with a person responsible, with a budget allocated to it, in order to ensure that in the likelihood that that particular risk event occurs, that there is a response and a very quick mitigation of the risk. And that brings us to the end of this learning unit 8. It is quite short. It deals with project risks, and we'll move on to learning unit 9.